There is a list. Most Amish girls never see it. It is not written down anywhere you could find it, not in a book, not on a wall, not in any letter your mother would hand you before the wedding. But it exists. It has always existed. And every Amish man who is serious about taking a wife knows what is on it, because his father told him, and his grandfather told his father, and the list has passed through the generations the way certain things do in closed communities, where the rules are held not in documents, but in the body language of older men, in the particular silence that falls when a man nods slowly and the men around him nod back, and nothing more needs to be said. You do not break a silence like that. You do not ask what was just agreed upon. You learn, if you are a girl in that world, to read those silences the way you read weather, by watching what changes in the room and understanding that the change concerns you, even if no one has looked at you directly. I did not know the list existed until 3 days before my wedding, and I did not know how far my husband intended to take it until the night that everything changed. Before I go any further, I want to pause and say something honestly. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now have not subscribed yet. And I understand that. You may have found this video by chance. You may still be deciding if this is a place you want to stay. But if you have ever felt like the rules of your world were written for everyone except you, if you have ever walked into a room and understood immediately that the conversation had been happening without you for a long time already, then I think you belong here. These stories are for you. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to the person on this side of the screen who is still learning how to say these things out loud. Now, the list. I was 19 when I became engaged to a man named Daniel. He was 26. He was from our district, the son of a well-regarded family, steady with his hands, quiet in the way that gets described as a virtue when it is a man being described that way. The engagement happened the way engagements happened. Our parents spoke, our bishop was consulted, my father gave his blessing in the front room while I stood in the kitchen and heard the murmur of it through the wall. I was not asked to come in. That detail matters. I was not asked to come in. I want you to hold that in your mind as I tell you the rest. The night I found out about the list, I was sitting with my older cousin Martha in her kitchen. She had been married 4 years. She was showing me how to press the dough for a bread her husband liked, and she was talking the way women talk when they have been waiting a long time to say something. Not all at once, in pieces, between other sentences, the way you press something important between the pages of a book so it survives the journey. She said, "Does your mother know that Daniel's family will be watching?" I said, "Watching what?" She pressed the dough. She did not look up. Then she said, "They watch for signs, before the wedding. They look for things in the girl, signs she has been properly raised, signs she will run a house the right way, signs she is not carrying something into the marriage that should have stayed behind." I was 19, and I had been raised in a community where whole conversations happened in silences you were expected to decode. So I asked her to be plain. She said, "The men check. They check the house your mother keeps. They look at your hands to see if the work shows. They ask other men about your father, about debts, about character. They watch how you move through a room when you think no one is looking. Daniel's uncle asked your father about your health in a way that was not really about your health." I felt something cold move through me. Not surprise exactly, something worse. Recognition. I asked, "Is there anything else on the list?" She was quiet. Then she said, "Hannah, there is one more thing. And it sounds worse than it is to English ears, though honestly, I am not sure it sounds better in our own language." I said, "Tell me." She said, Some of the older families believe a man has the right to know certain things about the girl's nature before the wedding. Not all families, not all districts, but some. It used to be more common. It is quieter now, but it has not gone. I waited. She said, "They call it being sure of the vessel. It means the man, or someone speaking for him, has the right to inquire, sometimes through the women who helped raise you, whether you are what they would call untouched. And in some families, in the older way of thinking, inquire is not just a word." The kitchen was very quiet. I said, "What does inquire mean exactly, in the older way of thinking?" Martha set down the bread. She said, "It means what you think it means. And it is wrong. I know it is wrong. But it happened to my aunt, and it happened to at least 2 girls I know of in other districts. I am telling you because you deserve to walk into your marriage knowing what you might be walking into." I sat there for a long time after she stopped. The dough sat on the table between us. Outside, her youngest was calling from the yard. She went to the window. Life continued the way it always does, in moments when you learn something that makes the floor feel unsteady. I want you to understand something about what happened next, because this is the part where my story stops being the story you expect. I did not go to my mother. I had learned early that her way of protecting me was to tell me the hard things would pass, and I did not want to hear that. I went to my father instead, the next morning when he was in the barn before breakfast. I stood at the door and I said, "Dad, I need to ask you about Daniel's family." He looked at me. My father was not an unkind man. He was a man who lived completely inside the world he had been given and believed in it without questioning the parts that should have been questioned, because questioning them would have required him to question himself. But he loved me, and I knew it in the way that made what came next both easier and harder than it should have been. I told him what Martha had told me. Not all of it. Enough. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Daniel is a good man." I said, "I know. That is not what I asked you." He said, "There are old ways, and there are the ways we actually live. No one in Daniel's family would do anything against your dignity." I said, "But you knew about the list." He did not say yes. He did not say no. He picked up what he had set down and turned back to his work. And in that turning, I had my answer. I went back to the house and sat in my room for the rest of the morning. 14 days until my wedding. I had just understood for the first time that the protection I had believed I lived inside was not shaped the way I had always thought. It was shaped like a fence, and the fence faced inward. Now I need to tell you about Daniel, because Daniel is the part of this story that I could not have predicted and still cannot fully explain. The week before the wedding, he came to our house for one of the approved visits. We sat in the front room. My mother brought coffee and stayed for the first portion, then found a reason to go to the kitchen and left the door slightly open, which was what was permitted. Daniel and I sat across from each other the way we always sat, in the careful way of 2 people engaged in a community where the engagement is not really about them getting to know each other, but about the families around them arriving at a satisfaction. We had sat this way perhaps 7 or 8 times since the announcement. We had talked about the farm and the weather, and one time about a hymn we had both known since childhood. We had not talked about anything that mattered. We had not been given the room to. And then he did something I had never heard of a man doing. He looked at me, and he said, "I heard you spoke to your father yesterday about certain things." I felt my hands go still in my lap. He said, "I want you to know I did not ask my uncle to do what he was going to do." He said it without looking away from me. I found out 3 days ago what my uncle had been planning, the asking around, the old way of checking. And I told him no. I said it clearly. He was not happy with me. I stared at him. He said, "I am not marrying my uncle's idea of what a wife should be. I am going to try to marry you, if you will let me." I did not know what to do with that sentence. I had not been given any vocabulary for it. So I did the thing I always did when I did not know what to do. I was quiet. And he let me be quiet. He did not fill the silence with more words. He just waited, with his coffee cup in his hands, in the front room of my parents' house, while my mother's footsteps moved softly behind the kitchen door. That night, I lay in my bed, and I thought about what a man who stops his uncle looks like. I thought about what it costs a young man in a community like ours to say no to an older man, to his own uncle, clearly. I thought about what kind of person decides to do that, quietly, without asking for recognition. And I thought about the fact that I had not known he was that kind of man, because we had never been allowed the kinds of conversations that would have told me. We married on a Thursday in November. The sky was gray and very low, and there was no wind. The ceremony was long. The bishop preached from Proverbs. I sat in my good dress with my hands in my lap, and I made my promises in front of God and everyone I had ever known. And I thought about the list. And I thought about the uncle who had been stopped. And I thought about the 19 years I had lived inside a community that had been checking me without my knowledge since before I was old enough to understand what checking meant. And I thought about the man sitting across the room in the men's section who had said no, clearly. The first night of our marriage, Daniel and I sat in the small room prepared for us in my parents' house. The lamp was low, the house was full of people, and the walls were thin. He asked me what I was thinking. Not what I was feeling, what I was thinking. Nobody had asked me that in a long time. I told him I was thinking about the list. He nodded. I said, "I want to know everything on it." He told me, all of it. The house, the hands, the health inquiry, the older checking, the thing his uncle had planned. He did not protect me from any part of it. He told me like someone who had decided that honesty was the only foundation he knew how to build on. When he finished, I was quiet for a while. Then I said, "Why did you stop him?" He said, "Because I read somewhere, in a book I was not supposed to have, that a man who needs to inspect a woman before he trusts her has already told her everything she needs to know about how much he plans to trust her later." I said, "What book?" He smiled a little. He said, "Does it matter?" I said, "It matters to me." He told me. It was not a religious book. It was a book someone in the district had brought back from a town visit and left in the back of the shop where Daniel sometimes worked, wedged behind a box of nails, the way things that are not quite permitted sometimes survive in communities like ours, half hidden, waiting. We talked until the lamp burned low. Not about the marriage the way everyone outside the door would have understood it. About the list. About the girls who had gone into their marriages not knowing. About Martha's aunt. About the silence that surrounds these things so completely that most women grow old inside it and never find a word that fits. It was the most honest conversation I had ever had inside that community. In the years that followed, Daniel and I built something that did not have a name inside our community because it should not have had to be built from scratch. We talked. We kept talking in the way we had started on that first night, carefully, Honestly, without the armor that most married people in that world wore around each other, until the armor became the only thing holding them upright. When I finally left the community at 24, Daniel knew before I said it. He had watched it happen, the way you watch a season change. He drove me to the edge of our county on a morning in early spring. We said goodbye in the particular way of people who love each other without being able to save each other. I have thought about the list many times since then, about the way it lived without ever being written down, about how many girls sat in wedding night rooms not knowing what had already been decided about them, about what it costs a young man to say no to his uncle, about my cousin Martha pressing something important between other sentences in a kitchen that smelled of bread, about my father turning back to his work in the barn, about the book wedged behind a box of nails, and about what it means to one day find the exact right word for all of it, in a therapist's office far from the gray November sky of your wedding day, and to understand that the word is not too strong, that it fits exactly. What Amish husbands are expected to check before the wedding is not a small thing. It is not a curiosity or a footnote. It is the whole architecture of a system that decides what a woman is worth before she has had a single chance to decide it herself. And the fact that one man in one barn once said no clearly is not a vindication of that system. It is a small fire inside a very large dark. If you grew up somewhere that had its own version of the list, I see you. If you were checked without your knowledge or your consent, in ways large or small, by the people who called it tradition or protection or faith, I see you. If you have ever stood in a kitchen and understood that the conversation about your life was already happening in another room, I see you. You were not a vessel. You were a person. You still are. And the life that was decided for you is not the only life you are allowed to want. Before you leave, I want to thank you for staying with me until the very end. I know there are millions of videos you could have watched today, yet you spent these moments here. But there is one thing I want to say honestly. More than 90% of the people who watch these videos still have not subscribed. So if this story touched something inside you, if it reminded you of a room you were not invited into, a list you were never shown, a silence you carried for longer than you should have, I hope you will subscribe. It is free, and it helps these stories continue. And before you go, tell me in the comments, what part of this stayed with you the longest? I would love to read your thoughts below.